potentially a significant barrier to the SNP succeeding in hanging on to its seats at Westminster is the insistence of the Greens on fighting 32 constituencies in Scotland in the general election, and the polling was indicating that there is it's 3, 4, 5% of people saying that they might vote Green in the Westminster election. Mr. Yousaf needed to be in a position to try to get that vote down, and he might have been hoping that this move would succeed in achieving that.
Now, this all started with a big row with the coalition partners in Scotland. Now, it's worth saying that the SNP does not have a majority, so they had to go into a coalition with the Green Party to get their legislation through the Scottish Parliament. This agreement was known as the Bute House Agreement, and a big bust-up happened over the government having to U-turn on key climate change targets. Now, Humza Yousaf is fighting to save his political life, and will he be able to pull it off? And of course, the great irony is that the person that will have the casting vote, because the numbers are so tight in the Scottish Parliament, is a woman called Ash Regan. Now, Ash Regan stood against Humza Yousaf during the leadership contest. They were probably the most furthest apart in terms of the three candidates. She eventually defected from the SNP. She left the SNP and she went over to the Alba party, and there's no love lost between those two. Humza Yousaf famously said when she went that would be no great loss. Now, Ash Regan is the most powerful woman in Scottish politics, and Humza Yousaf's fate basically rests in her hands. My goodness, life comes at you fast. Now, this morning, Humza Yousaf's written to all the opposition parties, including Alex Salmond's Alba party, urging them to rethink their plot to oust him. Now, let's catch up with two real experts on Scottish politics, both called John. Delighted to be joined by John Boothman, who is the Sunday Times' political correspondent. Hello, John.
How are you doing, Aisha?
Very good. And also on the line is Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde and Britain's polling guru. Sir John, welcome.
Hi, Aisha.
So, John Boothman, just give us an update as to where things stand right now.
I mean, let me begin by saying I'm fed up saying it's been an extraordinary week in Scottish politics. I've been saying it every week for the last year, and I'm fed up saying it's been a terrible week for Humza Yousaf, because I've been saying that for the last year as well, right? But where is it now? Humza Yousaf is still in position. He's got to get to Wednesday first, to those 2 votes of confidence that you spoke about. I've not heard or seen any men in grey kilts who might be going to see him, but there's a lot of disquiet within the SNP. Chaotic, dumbfounded, inexplicable, lots and lots of strong words about the situation that he himself has put himself in. He was wobbling and swithering the other night about staying on, but he got some resolve, we think, from his wife, and he's been out there saying he's still there and he's carrying on. On Wednesday, if you add up the numbers, the way it looks at the moment, on the one side you've got 63 votes for the SNP. On the other side you've got a combined number of votes from all the opposition parties that would add up to 63. There is, which would add up, I think, rather to 64. There's one vote. No, wait a minute, I've got my arithmetic slightly wrong, but it could end up, let me go here, it could end up at 64 each. And it will be the presiding officer who decides on a casting vote, and the presiding officer would give that casting vote to Humza, that he's going to remain the First Minister. The key vote, as you say, belongs to Ash Regan of the Alba party. No love lost, as you rightly say, between them. And, well, let's just see what happens. I think a lot of people would say, even if he survives that, he'll be in a weakened position, and he certainly won't be there after the general election, because we're not expecting the SNP is going to do very well.
Now, John, I mean, there's a lot of division in the SNP at the moment. Is it an absolute given that every single SNP MSP will vote for Humza Yousaf?
I think it's given, yeah, that all of those people will vote for Humza Yousaf. I was looking around today, suggestions that perhaps amongst the opposition that somebody might not turn up, might be ill or whatever. I've checked with all three parties. Labour, all their members will be present and correct. The Tories had slipped one person for a bit of this week, but that's been rescinded, and the Lib Dems are all going to be there, as are all the Greens. I think it's the case that, Humza's still hoping that he might get some change out out of the Greens, but you heard, for example, Gillian Mackay, a Green MSP yesterday, crying and blaming Humza exclusively for the problems that arose that ended up with the Greens out the coalition. And Ross Greer, another leading Green MSP, says that they'll be voting against Humza in that vote of no confidence, but in the second vote of no confidence, they won't support Labour's position of really voting no confidence in the government.
So, it's such a knife edge vote. Do you think he'll survive it, or do you think he'll have to go before the vote?
I probably think at the moment, I've been talking to Alex Salmond today. Now, Alex Salmond's being Alex Salmond. He's not giving anything away either way, but I think he's presented a set of relatively practical proposals to the government round about making independence more of a priority, round about a proposal where they accept all the recommendations of the cash review, and round about a practical proposal about Grangemouth and the oil refinery and investment there. It's possible Humza could accept that. It's possible Ash Regan could then throw in a lot with the SNP and keep Humza in place. I think at the moment probably looks as if it's going to be 64 each. And the presiding officer's vote, as I say, will be cast in favour of Humza, and he'll still be there. But, I mean, where does that leave him? It leaves him in a hugely weakened position as the First Minister. I mean, it's fair to say, I think, that at the moment, chatting around that, you know, some alternative candidates are already, as I put it, taking off their tracksuits and running up and down the touchline, waiting to see what happens. They're certainly checking out what's going on and what might happen if Humza does fall, what the rules would be in order to elect somebody else. We've got to remember, of course, that we might have a general election over the summer in October. And if the SNP, after Humza falls in his sword or is deposed, they need to get somebody and get somebody quite quickly.
And before we bring in John Curtice, John Boothman, who are the runners and riders in terms of who could replace Humza Yousaf? I mean, Kate Forbes is the obvious one that jumps to mind. Who else?
Well, people are talking about Kate Forbes, people are talking about Stephen Flynn, but he's in the wrong parliament, for want of a better expression. There's a possibility that somebody like Neil Gray, who's the health minister, might stand, though I'm told he's swithering a bit. He's not sure he's ready for it. And another suggestion seems to be Jenny Gilruth, who's the current education minister. But look, you know, Kate Forbes is somebody who's probably the person to beat. She got, nearly 50%, just was pipped at the post last year by Humza, but a lot of people in the SNP don't like her because of socially conservative views. And she, well, really, as I say, I think she's got a big base now in the party. There would need to be somebody who they could pick who could beat her in order to win that election.
And of course, if Kate Forbes does win it, you know, the Greens may have real problems working with her because they had a lot of issues with some of her kind of more sort of socially conservative policy areas. Well, let's bring in Sir John Curtice. So, John Curtice, what do you think this is going to do for the SNP's polling numbers?
Well, at this point, in response to that kind of question, Aisha, I just gently remind journalists that the speed of polling is not necessarily quite as quick as the speed of the news cycle. And the only honest answer to that question is that nobody knows. We'll have to wait and see whether we get some polling sooner rather than later. What we do know is that Humza Yousaf was already not particularly popular, even amongst those who have voted for the SNP in the past. There are doubts about his competence. And one would anticipate that those concerns will be also reflected and perhaps exaggerated further in the electorate as the result of what has happened. Beyond that, I mean, whether or not this is going to have much impact on the SNP standing, well, it depends on the reaction of basically yes supporters. The SNP's problem at the moment is that there's a significant body of yes supporters, i.e. people who will still vote yes in the referendum, who at the moment are saying, or were already saying they wouldn't vote for the SNP. The question is, does their number grow up or not?
And just take us through, what are the latest figures on support for independence, and just trot us through the latest figures for where the main parties stand?
Oh, support for independence is still running at just under 50%. It's unchanged throughout the whole of the SNP melodrama of the last 15 months or so. It's just that support for the SNP is down. The SNP are still narrowly ahead of Labour on average in the polls so far as votes, but that would already probably be enough for the SNP to be behind Labour in terms of seats. But I think part of what may have been behind Humza Yousaf's calculation was really, but not so much the parliamentary politics at Holyrood, which is where he's come unstuck, at least so far, as opposed to the electoral politics of the Westminster election. His party was indeed under threat in terms of its Westminster position. One of the reasons why it's under threat is because voters now perceive that the SNP as being divided. One of the sources of its division were the internal arguments within the SNP about the relationship with the Greens, and some of those around Kate Forbes wanted the party to get rid of it, which is now, of course, is what has happened. It's also the case that potentially a significant barrier to the SNP succeeding in hanging on to its seats at Westminster is the insistence of the Greens on fighting 32 constituencies in Scotland in the general election, and the polling was indicating that there is it's 3, 4, 5% of people saying that they might vote Green in the Westminster election. Mr. Yousaf needed to be in a position to try to get that vote down, and he might have been hoping that this move would succeed in achieving that. The problem is, of course, I think it's twofold. One is that I think one of the criticisms that's now going to start developing about him is that he is somebody who suddenly engages in U-turns and then as a result does end up with a lot of opposition and a lot of doubts about what he's doing. So what previous example was the fact, against the backdrop of a government that's been increasing income tax in Scotland and has been talking about the merits of its willingness to tax more highly and to spend more, then all of a sudden, Mr. Yousaf said, oh, no, I'm going to freeze the council tax. And that caused a lot of argument with Scottish local government, including many members of the many SNP councillors. Now, having said that the deal with the Greens was essential to the good governance of Scotland, he's now suddenly got rid of it. And I think it's going to be the question about his judgment that's going to be circulating. By the way, not just amongst voters, probably the crucial group now. Remember, for the most part, if prime ministers or first ministers fall, and we should all be aware of this, given what we've known at Westminster recently, Mr. Yousaf is probably not now more at threat, not from the vote next week, which, as John Boothman has indicated, he's probably going to survive, but rather what do SNP MSPs tell the SNP chief whip over the next week or so? That's where Mr. Yousaf's fate will ultimately lie, at least in the short run.
And John, just this point on the Greens, which I think is really interesting, because it felt like the SNP had built quite a kind of coalition of voters, where you've got some people on the sort of Kate Forbes side of things, but you did have like a lot of maybe kind of younger voters, progressive voters who did like the kind of greenish tinge that the SNP took on. Because of this row with the Greens, is there then a chance that obviously that kind of coalition is going to split? Does the Green Party provide a bit of a challenge in the way that the Reform Party is providing a bit of a challenge to the Tories in England?
Well, certainly, as I've already suggested, what Greens are an alternative way of voting for those who back independence. That's both why it's possible for the SNP to contemplate and having a coalition with the Greens, but it also indicates that they are also potentially a threat to the SNP in terms of maintaining its dominance of nationalist support in Scotland. And I think that's probably one of the concerns that some SNP MPs and MSPs have had about the deal. And it's certainly true that, in the end, however, the Greens are quite reliant on the support at Holyrood on the list vote. That's their crucial vote. And they're reliant quite heavily on the support of those who vote for the SNP on the constituency ballot. What is not entirely clear, because none of the polls tell us this directly, is how much of the support that the Greens get on the list vote comes from people who are Green first and vote for the SNP on the constituency vote because the Greens are not standing locally, and how many of them are actually people who are SNP first, but realizing how the Holyrood system works, are willing to vote for the Greens on the list vote. So there are frankly risks at here for both parties in the rupture that has now happened in the wake of Mr. Yousaf's decision.
And John, just coming back to you very briefly, if you will, I mean, what does this kind of mean in terms of if Humza Yousaf survives? What then happens to him, you know, afterwards? I mean, he's obviously going to be very, very weakened. I presume both Labour and the Tories could keep coming back with no confidence motions. How does he sort of really try and get much legislation through?
Well, I think what Mr. Yousaf has discovered is that there is no escape from the Greens. Because of the state of politics in Scotland now, none of the unionist parties are going to be willing to make life relatively easy for the Scottish government at Westminster in the way that the Conservatives were willing to do so between 2007 and 2011. They all expect to profit from the SNP losing ground in the Westminster election. And that therefore the only potential pliable partners are the Greens together with Ash Regan. It's going to get played out next week, and it's going to get played out throughout now, and perhaps above all, crucially, assuming Mr. Yousaf survives this long, in the budgetary process that will take place at the back end of this year and the beginning of next in the Scottish
Very
Parliament.
important. Well, look, we'll have to leave it there. Really interesting analysis there. My huge thanks to John Boothman, Scotland political correspondent for the Sunday Times, and Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclyde. Someone's just messaged in saying, Aisha, I can't believe so many people are still intending to vote SNP. It's definitely a case of heart ruling head.